Welcome to the Joanne Avison podcast. It's my absolute pleasure to have my guest, John Sharkey, with me today. How are you, John?
I'm doing great, Joanne, and as always, I love joining you for these conversations, rich conversations, hopefully.
Well, today's conversation is about a particular paper that you and I have both received a lot of questions about, given what we teach and who we teach in the anatomy lab and around the world in terms of manual therapy and movement and so on, because it's a very important piece of information that I want to really crystallize and clarify for people. Now, the paper is called The Influence of Long-Lasting Static Stretching on Maximal Strength, Muscle Thickness, and Flexibility. And I think the lead author is Konstantin Warnecke. There's Anna Brickman, Martin Hellebrecht, and Stefan Schiemann. A very, very interesting paper, and you actually brought it to my attention, John. What are the keys in this in the Journal of Frontiers in Physiology?
Well, what I would say is, like all papers, it's an interesting paper, but it's one that, from my perspective, requires caution. And the reason I say that is because initially what had actually happened was, it was an email from somebody who follows my work and just sent me a question about it. I believe that this paper had been discussed at the International Fascia Research Congress in Louisiana, or at least it was part of a presentation. But somebody was basically writing and asking, like, one, what's your general impression of the study? And do you think that the paper proves that static stretching increases strength? And so I would say that it's an interesting study, but as I say, it's one that requires caution because the methodology, which was painful, hour-long daily stretching using an orthosis, an orthotic device, which placed the ankle in a dorsiflexed position. So it's quite an extreme position, and put in there for an hour long. And to me, that is really far removed from normal human or clinical practice. I mean, it's thought-provoking from a mechanobiological standpoint, but not a model that I'd recommend therapeutically, not at all.
So tell me particularly why. I know the measure that led them to the idea of strength. We'll talk about stretching in a minute, but that led them to the idea of strength was that it was the girth of the muscle that was measured, not the quality of the muscular integrity. So it was a measure surrounding the muscle. And my curiosity was piqued out of the idea that if a muscle is injured or if you're doing strength training, to put it in layman's terms, strength training is based on repair, right? We pathologically damage myofascial tissue and it rebuilds itself to make a shape, which is very popular. Now, in this study, the muscle that was so-called stretched over a period of time also increased in girth, which is where I think the title implies strength has been given by stretching. And I think it's a very somewhat dangerous, you use the word cautious, but I would say dangerous idea that more and more and more static stretching will create more strength. Surely this is pathological. It's a repair system where the body is basically swelling the muscle to try to repair it, is it not?
The question really is, does this paper, prove that increased strength occurred? No, it doesn't prove that. The data shows angle-specific strength changes that are better explained by neural familiarization and also reduced inhibitory reflex tone, not by true hypertrophy of contractile capacity. So the authors didn't measure electromyographic activity. They didn't consider or even look at the Hoffman reflex or architectural variables. So, it doesn't even suggest the possibility that stretching increases, or that they say that stretching increases strength. But if it did, that would contradict, the gold standards in fitness principles. One in particular called specificity. So the answer is no. It did not increase strength in the muscle. And I get a little bit emotional about this, by the way, because I've been discussing this for years and years. And the problem is that we have individuals who look at a paper like this and they'll believe that perhaps maybe this research paper proves, because titles are designed to attract attention, not to convey, nuance. And strength and hypertrophy gains sounds like, resistance training outcomes. But in this study, the increase likely came from the test posture learning, or neural densification, or transient edema, not structural growth. It's what I refer to as mere familiarization. In other words, the individuals became more familiarized with the particular task that they had to perform, and so the more they performed it, the better they got at it.
So when you say the girth of the muscle was measured, and it doesn't mean they were stronger, can you make that correlate very specifically for us, please? Because I know there's people doing yoga that think more stretching, therefore it's better, it's going to strengthen you like going to the gym. And I think that's a misnomer that we can help unravel.
Yeah, so what we're looking at are, we're looking at probably at viscoelastic adaptations, and also sensory, what would you say, recalibration rather than muscle building. So when tissue is held for long durations, fluid redistributes and the nervous system redefines safe, safe range of motion.
Right.
It's really about shape changing. Let's use the language that's used in the paper. So it's redefining what we would call safe length. It's a kind of, densification of the stretch reflex rather than a structural transformation. And so, for me, the likely mechanism was really injury repair. The increased mass and the tension that were observed are largely due to sarcomere hyperplasia following microtrauma. And there's a whole range of influencing factors or things to be considered in terms of what would cause hyperplasia within the sarcomere. So this is a form of what I'd call pathological remodeling. It's not healthy adaptation. Histology showed inflammatory inflammation and edema, and that's consistent with damage repair, not with fascia mediated mechanotransduction.
So what you're saying then is that the measure of the girth of the muscle as the demonstration of greater strength is not an equation that follows. You're saying that that's pathological change in the tissue adapting to that extreme 1 hour long daily stretch. It's not actually a symbol of strength.
Not at all. Somebody could have a lymphatic issue where if they measured the girth of their anatomical leg, they'd see that the leg that has lymphatic issue is going to be larger, than the leg that, isn't pathologically affected. You can't say that there is true hypertrophy in the sense of what we call specificity of training, where somebody goes into a gym and they lift a certain weight. What happens initially is that when a person goes into a fitness center or health club, or they're doing home exercise, and regardless of the task, but let's just say in this case, they want to lift a weight. And so they take a weight that they've never lifted before. Let's say it's a 15-kilogram dumbbell. And, they struggle with it and they lift it. Well, they're learning how to do it. In other words, they're setting up the neuromuscular engrams. They're setting up the nervous system engrams, or the pathways with which the signals will travel. And they do the exercise and they repeat it. And they will feel some soreness in the tissues, but they're not making any major structural changes, any significant structural changes to the or alterations to the structure. What they're actually doing is they're changing the neurology, they're changing the nervous system aspect. And what will happen basically is they'll reach a point where lifting that weight will become easy. Now they've learned how to do it. By the way, if they've learned how to do it wrong, then they're always going to do it that way. They're always going to do it wrong, but they'll do it and they'll learn how to do it. If you change any aspect of that exercise to a different angulation relative to the joints, or perhaps you change the speed, or if you change any aspect of it, you'll find that you won't be so good at it again. In other words, that's specificity. So it's like saying, if you want to be a good runner, run. If you want to be good at swimming, swim. But, to say that, if you want to build muscle and you want to build strength, stretch, that just absolutely contradicts, the last 100 years of research in exercise physiology. So, it can be. I'm not saying that the authors of the paper set out to mislead anybody. I'm saying that people reading the title, or perhaps maybe if they don't have the skill and the ability to be able to, critique the paper, they might walk away thinking that the paper suggested that it's good to hold stretching for long periods of time. And I would suggest that it's not. I keep coming back, Joanne, people who've been to my presentations are well used to hearing me saying, all you have to do is look at the abdomen of a woman who's been through pregnancy, and you will see the reality of stretching living connective tissue. And they even have the correct name for it: stretch marks. The marks that are the evidence that this tissue has truly been stretched. So we're not talking about somebody going through, either anatomical or physiological range of motion. We're talking about going through physiological range of motion and then going further. And so people mistake that. When people say they're stretching, many people are not stretching. They're simply going through physiological range of motion, and that's a lovely thing to do. Then they could ask the question, should it be static or should it be dynamic? That's another question for another day, as to what are the subtle differences between those two, or what are the obvious differences between those two things. But generally speaking, they're not stretching. They're simply going through physiological range. So I don't want people to think that we're disagreeing with them, when in fact we may not be disagreeing with them at all. If somebody wishes to go, through a range and do this, that's not stretching. That's normal physiological range of motion. It's when you try to go further and you hold it and sustain it, and you literally try to lengthen tissue, which is a difficult enough thing to do, incidentally. And that's why it does take time. If you lived in a house at the bottom of a mountain, you'd find that where your garden was, there'll be a small little kind of a hillock, in place. Why? Because over thousands of years, and with rainfall, the soil has made its way down because of gravitational forces. So we call this creep. And that's what you'll see. So that can happen in living tissue as well. Not necessarily a good thing. But what people are sometimes mistaking is that if the tissues, for instance, something within the sarcomeres, that the Z lines, the walls of the sarcomeres have been brought closer together, and they haven't returned. In other words, they've stayed in what you might call a shortened position. And you think, well, how can I get those sarcomeres to return to normal? And of course, the idea would be, well, what you do is you stretch them. Now, you as we say in Ireland, you pull the bejesus out of them. That's the wrong thing to do, because all you're doing there is forcing your agenda on living sentient tissue. And you can't, my position on that is, yes, you can do it if you want to. We live in a democracy. I don't think it's the best approach. I think you're far better off taking a softer approach. And in fact, my father was a West of Ireland man. He was from a place called County Roscommon. And my mum and my aunts, they would bake on a Thursday. So we'd have apple tarts and rhubarb tarts and whatever. And so we'd have a great weekend, with all these little treats. But then we'll say, Tuesday morning, there was nothing, right? So you weren't looking for anything on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, but come Thursday, brilliant. We were back into the smell of the cooking. And my mum would put these into a press. And, if you went to the press and you went to pull the press open, the press wouldn't open for you. You're thinking, why isn't the press opening? And so my cousins would say, no, what you have to do is you've got to push the press and then it springs open. So that's called a latch-key. And the latch-key is a technique that I use then in manual therapy and in movement therapy, which is the very opposite to what people do. In other words, when you feel that you've got muscle tissue that feels tight, and of course, what's your initial thought process? If it feels tight and in your head you think it feels short, well, I'm going to stretch it. And I would say it's the very opposite thing that you need to be doing. What you need to do is you need to exaggerate the distortion, and you'll get a latch-key effect. In other words, tissue will, of its own accord, come back to normal physiological range of motion. If you want to say release, fair play, say release, it's fine.
And in your opinion and massive experience, because you're very unusual as a clinical anatomist who actually has devoted decades to creating a clinical manual therapy that actually honors that physiology and that study of exercise physiology as well as clinical anatomy. Do you think that the misleading is the amount that we do. For example, we're not saying don't stretch as in, interlock your fingers, turn your hands inside out, have a lovely yawn and a reach to your fingertips and all that. We all love that. It's what you call luxurious and pandiculation and all of that. You're not absolutely not saying not that. What you are saying is don't go to that end of range and then think that going beyond it is okay, because you are actually restructuring your structure and it's very difficult for it to return from, as I understand it.
Yeah. I mean, this paper, you have to remember, was taking an avian wing from, a particular bird species, and it was attached to weights so that the weights were therefore pulling on the connective tissues. And that was held for 24 hours for a month. So, it might bring forward interesting information as to what happens to connective tissue that is held under those type of forces for 24 hours a day for a month. But then you also have to remember it was a specific quail, a specific avian tissue, which is completely different to human tissue, completely different. In fact, of all the species you could think of picking, the quail is its connective tissue is very, very different arrangement to human connective tissue. So I'm not quite sure, what the crossover would tend to be in that regard. But, with regards to just static stretching, it's a difficult enough conversation, because what people have to understand is this. In order for this stuff that we have in our body that we call muscles, muscularis, muscularum, meaning little mice. So this stuff, what we do know is that from an evolutionary viewpoint, this red protein, it's a tubular protein that we have in the human body, and it seems to be expert at creating forces that allow for a pulling effect to occur. So what you might call a shortening. Now, again, if I had time with people, as you know, Joanne, we might use slightly different language, but let's stick with shortening. There's going to be a shape change to the tissue and it's going to shorten. But that shortening is a pulling effect, because muscles cannot push. Muscles can only pull. Now, if you want to stimulate these specific cells, muscle cells, to do what it is that they're experts at doing, then you need to stimulate them. And the stimulation is, in fact, a change in the shape. And the change in the shape is a change in the kind of in an expansive shape, or if you want to say lengthening. So you have to initially lengthen the tissue in order for the cell to be able to do what it does. If you don't lengthen the tissue, then it won't do anything. Now, if you're sitting there listening to me talking and you're not doing a lot, you're still doing something, right? You think, really? Absolutely. Even when you're lying in bed at night and you're sleeping, you're doing enough that it keeps the muscle tissue in what we call tone. In other words, muscles are never turned on or turned off. As you know, there's always a level of tone. That's number one. Now, if you want to go and lift something, let's say you want to lift a 5-kilogram dumbbell, you will recruit a specific number of these cells, muscle cells, in order to accomplish that task. You won't innervate more cells than are necessary to complete the task. Why would you? There's something wrong if you were doing that.
Right.
So, people will say then, oh, my muscle tissue in my neck, my muscles around my neck are really tight and short. Has the weight of your head got heavier? If the weight of your head's got heavier, well, then it would make sense, because you're recruiting more muscle fibers in order to be able to, maintain that the posture necessary to hold the weight of the head. But if the weight of your head hasn't increased, then why have you got an increase in tone within the muscle? Well, it could be that your head is not where it should be. In other words, it's gone forward, a forward head posture. And that would actually make some sense, because the fact that your head has moved forward changes the shape of the muscle tissue. In other words, it stimulates it, and therefore the muscle is going to react against it. So when you're doing what you call stretching, what you're doing is you're changing the shape of the muscle in the direction of what we call lengthening, which tells you that when you do that, what does the muscle do? it must contract.
Yeah.
Now, if you're statically holding that position, that means the muscle is contracted and it's lengthened. So we would call that an eccentrically held isometric contraction. I don't think that many people would ever describe a stretch as being an isometrically held eccentric contraction. But that is exactly what they're doing. But I don't think many people really, have worked that out, because they just see people stretching and they think, well, that's the thing to do.
And therefore that's making them more flexible. So instead of being wider, they're going to be longer. I mean, it's crazy, actually.
Well, you could say there are brief static holds that could aid relaxation if done in the particular way. We have things called post-isometric relaxation and so on. But prolonged painful stretching is necessary and would be, in my estimation, counterproductive. So, movement and graded variability are far more physiological than trying to, lengthen tissue passively. So it's a big conversation, and I think it's something that requires time. I mean, it's great that we can have this conversation today, but it really does require investment of time and effort. And one of the things that I've even found in myself, and I've said this many times before, I am institutionalized because, I've spent so many years in the universities gaining my degrees and being told that this is the way it is. And so you become institutionalized. And that's why I struggle so much with the fact that language means so much to me. So we use the word, mechanistic, or, mechanotherapy, or mechanotransduction. And I struggle with those words because it has the word mechano or mechanical,
Sure.
when in fact, one of the things that I've said before in the past is, if anybody's familiar with Thomas Nagel, who came out with the phrase, what is it like to be? In other words, when they're talking about consciousness or conscious entities, does a chair think? Does a chair or a car or a rock have the ability to think? And he said, well, what is it like to be a rock? What is it like to be a chair? But we know what it's like to be a human being. But what is it like to be a machine? Because that is, what we're supposed to be. Man as machine. So what is it like to be a machine?
No idea.
It wouldn't be anything. It wouldn't be anything to be like a machine. We are not machines. So, yeah, I just don't know how we're going to win this argument, because all you can say is, yes, the language is convenient, and great, the language is convenient. The problem with it is that it underscores, most of what people teach in terms of the human movement, which is man as machine. And so
It's biomechanics. It wrecks my head. I've said it a million times. We are bioemotional because we are in motion as a symbol of being alive. We are emotional, energy in motion. That's what we are. Personally, I think the entire fascial matrix is based on the management of that energy in motion. So our emotional status, that's another whole rabbit hole. But the thing about biomechanics that just defeats me every single time is this idea that it's based at the most fundamental level on planes of motion that cut the body in half and demonstrate its asymmetry, seeking symmetry at some level. And the other part being that the first, second, and third class levers, when there are no levers in nonlinear biologic forms. And I personally think it's time that we raise the game from these linear experiments and linear biological impositions as if we're made of hard matter physics when we're made of soft matter, and start asking much more interesting questions about how we shape shift, how we shape change, rather than imposing a completely unrealistic constraint on the body beyond any reasonable time, and then extrapolate overarching theories about the result, that because the muscle girth was the only thing that was measured, therefore it must be strengthened. Why? Well, how did that title come up? It's actually, I think, quite misleading, if I may say.
Well, it can be, I suppose, but also I think they were using, once again, they were using certain language in the paper that I'd never heard before. I believe it was language that they simply made up, and that's fine, but I think they should have mentioned that. You and I would use the word fasciotegrity, where we say, you combine fascia with tensegrity. So fascia science with tensegrity science, you bring those two things together. But, you make it known to people, look, this is a made up word and we're just using it for convenience. But in scientific papers, to introduce a language that nobody has heard before without putting it into context, I think was a mistake on their part, you know. So, and that's another issue, by the way. How does the paper relate to fascia? They didn't mention it. They didn't mention it. Fascia is not a muscle to be stretched. So there was no mention of fascia anywhere, you know. And of course, fascia and muscle are integrated. They're part of the continuity. You can't necessarily affect one without affecting the other, but you can certainly affect them in different ways. Fascia has a different recovery time compared to muscle fiber. So there's immediately a difference between the two. And you can hear people like Robert Schleip, who has said, you know, that the research is suggesting that it's not delayed onset muscle soreness, but delayed onset fascia soreness. So there are some experts who, you know, who we respect and look up to, who would also agree and say that you can make specific differentiations between this red protein versus connective tissue, in this case, the specialized tissue called fascia. So yes, they are same, but different. And you can, in fact, approach them in a different way with the type of training that you're involved in, if you're knowledgeable about your fascia. But obviously, if you don't know, well, then you can't know what you don't know.
Well, I'm going to finish up this podcast with you with the discussion that they've offered at the end. We hypothesize stretching-induced muscle damage comparable to effects of mechanical load of strength training that led to hypertrophy and thus to an increase in maximal strength. Increases in range of motion could be attributed to longitudinal hypertrophy effects, e.g. increase in serial sarcomeres. Measured cross-education effects could be explained by central neural adaptations due to stimulation of the stretched muscles. Is that clear, or can that be misinterpreted as stretching induces strength?
So let me be as clear as I possibly can as to why this claim cannot be extrapolated to humans or fascia. So we start with species and muscle type difference, as I said. So what they were looking at was the anterior latissimus dorsi in an avian slow twitch postural muscle. And they used, you know, continuous low level activity and high connective tissue content. This is what they were examining. And this differs vastly from human locomotor muscles, which I mentioned earlier. You know, its collagen architecture and its sarcomere addition capacity differ fundamentally from mammalian muscle. So it's completely different. So, and the strength was measured in vitro tetanic force under artificial electrical stimulation, not voluntary contraction. And so therefore, I'm a physiologist, and from that viewpoint, it reflects biochemical adaptation in isolated tissue, not functional strength or load capacity in vivo. So the quail muscle was subjected, as I said earlier, to 24-hour continuous tension for an entire month. You know, so human 1 hour daily stretch, if you were to do it, is neither continuous nor comparable in mechanotransductive environments, hydration, perfusion, you know, neuromodulation. Really, again, I mentioned earlier the absence of the reflex physiology. So, you know, it's just it can't be extrapolated to either humans or to fascia. And I could go on.
I know. And I thank you for what you've said. And I hope it's useful. And I hope it stimulates some really lovely conversations. As always, press the subscribe button and do send us comments. We'll happily answer them. I'll forward them to John. And underneath here, we're going to put the details of where John is in Dublin, Ireland at NTC, the National Training Centre, where you can study our whole range of absolutely wonderful trainings. I get to be on faculty working on the higher diploma course, which I love. And that comes after the certification course in neuromuscular therapy if you want to really, really dive deep on this beautiful work. And there's all sorts of opportunities to become a personal trainer, to work with Pilates, to do all kinds of things. So, John, love having your work in the world. Really appreciate being on staff at NTC. And I cannot wait for the next human dissection. Is it going to be at King's College?
King's College, yeah, and in June. And hopefully people will at least consider coming. www.ntc.ie/dissection/London. And remember, everything that I say could be completely and utterly wrong.
God bless you.
But it's great to have different opinions. People can have different opinions. I've no problem with that whatsoever. But let's just be as informed as we possibly can, and then form your opinion. And if we differ, we can still go and sit down and have a drink and be cordial and be well mannered. And we don't have to agree. But all we're doing is putting forward, a reflection of a life lived of 40 years, 45 years of more. In my case, I started out in this voyage quite young in life. I was lucky to do that. So that's all I'm doing. I'm just putting forward my opinion based on what I think is good, solid science, and people can come to their own opinions. Isn't that right?
Can't wait to hear them. Please don't forget to comment and reply if you're listening to the podcast, and please put comments on the YouTube. We get back to everybody. Take care, God bless, and have a great day. Thank you, John.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.